Hello, everyone. So up next, we have John King. John has several years of experience in the IT industry. John was actually scheduled to speak last year at Tech Symposium, but we had to, that was right as COVID hit, so we had to cancel that, but we're glad to have him back. Today, he's going over the MITRE attack framework. Very cool stuff. John, welcome.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me. Definitely looking forward to getting a chance to kind of walk through these concepts. So this is a high level overview. What we really want to spend some time talking about today is what CALDERA is, how it fits into the overall model of that attack kind of encourages, and then from there discuss how we can leverage it. So we'll jump in with the deck here and start. Just again, we want to cover what the attack matrix is as a knowledge base. We want to discuss CALDERA and then talk about how we can leverage this framework within our potential workplaces. And so as we jump in with attack, the first thing we want to acknowledge, if you guys haven't come across it before, go and check out attack.mitre.org. An excellent knowledge base, a ton of great information. I think I discussed this a couple of years back for a different discussion with Tech Symposium, but I've been a fanboy of this framework and everything around it for the last several years, just because of the work that's gone into it and how useful and valuable it is. Key thing about all of this at the end of the day, MITRE's role in all of this is as a federally funded research and development center. And so because they are federally funded, this is a not-for-profit thing. So there's another concept that we'll discuss, or another project that MITRE is running that really want to emphasize. That's not a grading system for any vendors or products. At the end of the day, they're just evaluating the capabilities of different products according to the vendor setup. Attack itself is an acronym for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. Really, at the end of the day, this is a knowledge base of the patterns of behavior that are observed by adversaries based on the results of analysis and forensics testing following an incident. And so we look at the approach here. What we're really trying to do with attack is create a more common vernacular around malicious activities. That's the kind of baseline approach there. So when we look in a lot of the CISA advisories, the InfoGuard advisories, and what we start seeing more and more from Microsoft, from CrowdStrike, from these different sources in terms of how they're analyzing patterns of behavior and attacks after the fact, we're seeing them leverage those MITRE indices for the different TTPs. And our goal there is really to emphasize that we have this consistent vocabulary that we're sharing with everybody. So we talk about the knowledge base. It goes deeper than just describing the activity itself. It does talk about use cases, examples, which threat actors are known to use it, what software is involved in that. And it talks about options for mitigating and detecting, as well as providing references to different resources that describe that use case. And then within that, since initial inception, it's gone through several revisions, of course, but primarily, one of the most valuable aspects of it is looking at your specific use case, right? So the overall matrix for enterprise here is really looking at the total suite, but we have some pre-attack activities that get acknowledged, Windows specific view of the matrix, the Mac OS specific view into specific cloud environments. So that overall aspects for clouds, but also specific cloud environments based on those different variable aspects. And then getting into mobile devices, and really key is this the infrastructure component of us, the industrial controls. This has a lot of different flavors that are very difficult to quantify within the same realm as your standard IT environment. So looking at the system itself, it's expanded a lot since its original inception. As you can see, these reconnaissance and resource development activities. And as you break this down, so this is with the sub techniques hidden, this entire matrix is really focused on describing the patterns of activity in the flow. So you may have heard, Lockheed Martin's kill chain or cyber kill chain. This is a similar kind of concept in describing the phases of an attack, but the goal here is to describe the specific techniques that would fall within each of these tactics. this tactic of reconnaissance is going to have these sub techniques here. And as we flow to the right, that's progressing through the phases of an attack. This is available. It's no cost of membership or anything like that. This is freely available. They actually host all the source for the site on their GitHub. So it's very easily accessible, and really a lot of organizations are pivoting off of this and finding ways to leverage it and contribute. So again, rapidly expanded adoption. There are several additional MITRE sponsored projects and others, open source and other organizations are taking on different approaches to how this can be leveraged in an effective way. One of my favorite things coming out of MITRE, even without Katie Nichols as one of the main advocates previously, she left. ATT&CK and the Power Hour presentations are outstanding. They go way beyond the just base use cases for the framework that the matrix is by itself. Talked a little bit about expanding the matrix of the knowledge base. A lot of those key factors for each of the different activities, the patterns of behavior, have been added since initial inception. And then again, talking about the increased depth of detail and correlation to threat actors, down to, if you look at the specific threat actors themselves, it describes the industries that they're commonly known to target. So you may acknowledge that there are certain threat actors that are more likely to target government entities, vice financial institutions, vice think tanks, and it really ties back to their motivations, to what their end goal is that the goal there is to be able to allow organizations to leverage real threat intelligence more specific to their organization without having the overhead of your own internal threat intel team. And so we talked a little bit already about some of those adjacent efforts. So from that attack matrix we spawned off, Rabobank has open sourced their detect framework, and it's really an attempt to kind of map where your organization has coverage over those different TTPs that are described in attack, what the quality of the data sources is, and really create a more manageable, measurable structure to help integrate and operationalize what attack can offer. STIX as a separate project is one of the core components that MITRE is trying to continually leverage. And so translating TTPs into STIX language so that it's more readily available for information sharing, for knowledge sharing, and integrating in with each organization's individual workflow, is a key component there. As a separate, I'd almost say pre-production project, threat report and attack mapping is one of my absolute favorite concepts. I think it's an amazing and underutilized project, but the core concept there is to try to automate processing reports. So if we're following up on an activity, we're following up on a breach, and we identify the report has some specific patterns of behavior that are described, we want to leverage TRAM to help identify those and correlate what are the specific activities, the TTPs that are described in attack, where are those described in the report, so we can figure out the use cases, the frequency, the different situations, and try to create more metadata to provide that structured analysis. TRAM is one of the most amazing conceptual projects. It's still in basically early beta, but the source code is out there. It takes advantage of some good natural language algorithms that are really helpful in understanding how to structure that automated analysis approach. An attack evals by itself could be its own separate entire workshop. The concept here is that different vendors will bring their product to the table, and MITRE's approach is to basically leverage adversary emulation activities to gauge where those products are in terms of their ability to detect and prevent an alert and provide enriching information, all of these aspects to help people understand how effective those products are. Again, this is where they're publishing the results. MITRE's publishing the results, and you can look at attackevals.mitre.org. That's going to redirect you to the MITRE Center for Ingenuity. The big aspect there is, or the big understanding that you have to have, is that these are the raw results. You're going to have to gauge the effectiveness based on translating those raw results. As a federally funded research development center, MITRE's not passing any judgment or trying to assign a grade or a score to these at all. They're just trying to offer the scenario. And then finally, CALDERA, which this is an inaccurate description, but at the end of the day, CALDERA is an excellent framework, and we'll go deeper into that. But it is a project tied to overall the efforts around ATT&CK. And so we'll jump into CALDERA. The biggest thing to understand is that it has a core purpose. That core purpose is one very small piece of the capability here and what we want to discuss. So again, another acronym, so the Cyber Adversary Language and Detection Engine for Red Team Automation. I caution anybody reading that to think that it's really possible to automate any red team activities, pen testing activities. I think the core purpose of hacking in general, pen testing, red teaming, is that when you bring that human aspect, you're looking beyond what a machine can think and do on its own. And so automation is in and of itself not something that fits in well with the red team mindset and approach. So looking at the two core components here, the core system itself is that framework, and there is that asynchronous command and control that can be accessed and leveraged through a REST API. And then we have a web interface to go with that. And then plugins. And this is where we get into a lot of fun about the capabilities and the potential of what the core system can do. But this core aspect, these plugins, there are several that are pre-built, that are ready to roll. There are some that have been added, especially since inception. And there's some excellent functionality already built in. But they've also made it very easy to build your own additional plugins. It's a key aspect. So when we talk about red team automation, really the reason that this becomes so critical is that it's expensive to call IBM X-Force Red and say, hey, I want to make sure that my organization is secure. Come out and tell me what we can improve on. That's a huge engagement. Not every organization has $200,000, $100,000, $300,000, and 6 months or a year to spend on that type of activity. Very often, they're focused on much lower overhead, much shorter timeframes. And so this granular, repeatable, documented approach becomes a critical aspect that was missing, and that a lot of the existing C2 frameworks are not targeted towards. So right now, if you work with Covenant, if you work with Empire, they're really focused on the offensive aspect without all the consideration for how do I document everything about it, right? And then at its core, it's very vanilla Python, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Run it locally in a container. I have it running. We'll walk through in just a basic Ubuntu VM right now, but I've run it on Chromebooks. I've run it on Raspberry Pis. I've run it on Latte Pandas. It's such a functional, modular tool in it, and it's easy to work with. So again, we talk a little bit about that C2 framework, and the concept here. We follow that similar model of, me provide a dropper to download my actual malware, run it in memory. Running in memory, then I have the ability to beacon back and check for instructions, and then I follow those instructions. So we deploy agents. Our agents are going to be those in-memory components that are running on our target machines. The abilities are the specific activities that we can perform. The adversaries are scripted abilities. So we would run an operation by assigning an adversary to run against specific agents. So we define what our agents are that we have, that basically our targets, our victim machines, and then the abilities correlated to adversaries would be run to do that. We'd build that operation to draw them together. And then finally, as a result of those abilities running on the target machines, we have facts. Those are things that we bring back it can be results of different scripts that are run. It can be things that we bring to the table that we define through the initial build out or through further investigation and analysis of what is returned, any of those pieces. So this is where, when we look at the core functionality, we talk about the agent, the abilities, the adversaries, again, surface level. As we know, very rarely is the stuff on the surface where the true value is. We look at the capabilities there and defining objectives, allowing and facilitating red-blue team collaborations. This is where you may have heard threat hunting and purple teaming. This is the perfect tool to centralize that activity. When we talk about the game board aspect, it's no longer just the collaboration, it's live exercises, it's scorekeeping, it's improvement in real time, the campaign planning and being able to not just define our approach by assigning abilities to adversaries, but what are those bootstrap abilities? How are we escalating to test, if obfuscation changes our ability to detect, or what our incident response procedures would be, those aspects that allow us to get more and more granular, more and more advanced. We get into the plugins and API and the ability to expand and customize what we need CALDERA to do for us or to facilitate for us. And then going back to that concept of, this is validatable, this is things that we can audit against, that reporting aspect and documenting in very granular detail what happened, when it happened, correlating that to logs, to system events. The analysis and decision-making aspect is incredible. If you look at a lot of the documentation, there's greater and greater emphasis over the last couple of years on the decision-making capability, tying in to almost machine learning, and then being able to allow that to leverage how an adversary makes decisions and flows, how it determines what adversaries or what abilities should be applied to a specific agent. And then the training aspect. And this is a key component that is not available enough. When you initially deploy CALDERA, there is a plugin available for you off the bat to walk you through training, very much CTF style, badges for different activities. And when you perform that, the checks are built in, and when you get through those, you have the option to send your key back, basically your end flag back to MITRE for a certificate. And the goal there really is to encourage complete and effective understanding and use of the tool. So I say that, it's not out there enough. Often you're going to a separate event, you're going to a separate resource to figure out how to use something. In this case, it's built right in with a tool, which is an incredibly valuable consideration. So looking at expansion and growth, we've talked a lot about each of these different aspects, and just wanted to recap on some of these items that we're looking beyond. We're looking beyond the initial approach and really seeing what's under the surface, right? So we talked about the tip of the iceberg and what's underneath there. Really, this is the tip of the iceberg that we're scratching even today. These additional sponsored projects and how it's getting in there. We're seeing rapid adoption of CALDERA itself, and then the expanded matrix and knowledge base is only further feeding into our ability to leverage CALDERA to build our intelligence into our workflows. All of these aspects are critical to both how ATT&CK is viewed and used and how CALDERA facilitates a key differentiator within our organizations. So when we talk about plugins, Pathfinder is an excellent joint project between MITRE and Siemens. If you don't know, Siemens makes a ton of ICS specific devices. Really, its capability is around taking an MAP scan, for example, or Siemens does have a separate vulnerability assessment scanner, and leveraging the results of those to map out where vulnerabilities live, and then facilitate creating an adversary profile based on the abilities that would leverage those vulnerabilities to gain access to a system. It's almost an adversary building tool that can be customized to your specific environment, to the vulnerabilities that are present at the time, to demonstrate where the risk is. Human, I love, is one of the most undervalued, underrecognized, unknown concepts. And in this case, this plugin is there to leverage Python, PowerShell, different automation aspects to script simulated user activity and behaviors. So we think about use cases very often. An example I like to use, a pen test wouldn't stop at what a Nessus scan indicates, right? A Nessus scan by default is going to tell you, oh, hey, this Cisco Smart Install vulnerability is an informational result, except we know that it's so easily exploitable, and that if you can compromise a layer 2 device, then you can own the network. able to put yourself as a man in the middle in any communications that you can view, it's trivial almost, right? So to be able to identify that and build in human activities, actual things that people would do, processes they would follow into your approach is a really valuable aspect. The debrief functionality allows you to export granular detailed results. Right now, you have the option to include graphical representations of the different operations, the steps that each operation took, where the facts were. You can export to JSON or PDF format. I export both when I go through purple team exercises with my clients, specifically so that they can see that raw initial representation of what took place. But also, as the previous panel discussed, data analysis is a critical piece. I'm not going to parse through this stuff manually. I bring that into Power BI. I have a standard reporting template that allows me to correlate not just the operations and the abilities that were used, but also the results, whether or not it was successful, what information it collected. And then from the client, we'll collect their logs and we'll parse analyze their logs as part of it to associate and correlate. This is what we did with CALDERA to simulate an adversary. This is what your system detected. Here are the logs and alerts we received. And then looking at what those logs were, what they should have been, how can we improve? How can we generate the right alerts, create the right information, allow that information to get to administrators to facilitate actual investigation and response. As a data analysis aspect, this debrief and the ability to get those JSON results out of there is critical. And then response, and this is again a very underutilized concept, but we're going to say, hey, maybe I have a Jupyter notebook or from Azure Sentinel, they've got their Atom scripts that will allow you to automate and orchestrate some activities as a direct response. We can test and refine that. And the concept here with response is that I can build that into my process for testing. So these are very, very valuable aspects when we think about wearing multiple hats and working with organizations to improve resilience and responsiveness to security incidents, which is where I live day to day. So applicability and use case, we talked a little bit about already, the red team automation, adversary emulation aspect. And really when we think about automation, we're manually designing the approach. What we're automating is that repeatability. We're automating that consistency so that, hey, I have, this ability to connect to the API and develop a consistent set of checks, of tests, of attacks that I want to target my application, my standard workstation, my standard server build, et cetera. And when we issue an update, when we make a change to production, before we push that full load, I want to confirm that I'm still getting the detection, that I still have reduced my attack surface effectively. This is where we build this type of a tool into that process, right? And it's not common right now, especially in the middle market, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the core concept here is that I have a repeatable approach to reduce the workload, reduce the head count that I need to build in that type of capability into the workflow. Incident response exercises, I'm sure we can see really clearly how something like this would be really valuable in facilitating that. What's often not looked at enough, and this is coming from somebody that provides assessments and advisory services to middle market clients across all industries. We set up our SIM, we leverage a third party for that. We never get around to making sure that it does what it says it can do, it does what it's capable of doing. Examples that I like to use are around some very expensive, very well-known third-party SIM solutions that will say, yes, we can detect that and we have a way to test it. What they're testing at the end of the day is if their product receives the right information, does it generate an alert? What it's not testing is if your environment is going to generate that information correctly. And that's a key distinction there. We look at change management, orchestration, and unit testing, especially when we get into updates. One of the most challenging aspects that a lot of organizations are facing today, especially with constrained resources, with remote work, is how do we confirm that this update, this change isn't going to break things, right? So the combination of unit testing, of that API approach, so that we can continually test the human aspect, right? Run those scripts against there. Can I collect the data that indicates that these standard business processes that I've built scripts for, will work properly. I'll get the expected results after the change. The capabilities here are phenomenal in terms of what we can put together for organizations. And then we talked a little bit already about that validation that we're able to prevent an attack, so block the activity or prevent the activity from succeeding, detect that activity beyond just logging to our local device, get it to our SIM, view the network traffic and correlate that activity to flows that we know exist, that we can observe, and then generate the right alerts. And another example I like to use, when a lot of anti-malware products see that Mimikatz was targeted or was attempted to be run, they'll block it and they'll send an alert that, hey, Mimikatz was detected, and they'll leave it at that. You have to go to the server, figure out what device it was run on. Is it a problem? Was it a one-off? But generally, if somebody's trying to run Mimikatz on a device, especially in a conventional environment where you have an internal network and an external network and maybe a DMZ, that's a problem that deserves investigation. A lot of these tools, though, are saying, hey, I've quarantined this, I've blocked it, you're good to go, no action required. It ignores the concept that somebody brought a malicious tool into my environment and attempted to dump LSAS to see valid credentials and NTLM hashes. That's kind of a big deal. Even if you stop that particular activity, someone's got a foothold in my environment. I need to investigate and contain and eradicate that. So these are where that alerting capability has to improve to reduce that time to containment, and being able to validate that is a key aspect. Jumping down, I do want to do just a quick basic walkthrough of CALDERA, the environment, and then try to wrap that up so we have some time to get to kind of really away from just the pure technical side and talk about the soft skills side and how this plays into everything that you've got going on in your lives. So what I have going on right now, I have a basic Ubuntu VM. This is just without the actual desktop environment, so very straightforward, as lightweight as possible. And from here, all that I have going on is you can clone down your CALDERA repo and build it right off of there. Just get your Golang installed, make sure you have Python 3 and pip going, and the rest of the requirements should build themselves. I think maybe UPX is an optional add-on if you want to install that as well. But at the end of the day, you end up with a web server. In this case, I'm running on a local VMware Workstation Pro. This will run in VirtualBox. This will run in a container. It's very modular. The other device I have running is a basic Windows 10 device. Here you can see I've already run the dropper. So this is just going to call back through PowerShell to my local server. You can see I have access to that in the background, and just pull down the malicious payload into memory and then run it. And then we'll discuss kind of the play here. So when we look at the actual interface. So when you first access it, you have to log in. The default login credentials are defined in your config file. And then we have our standard navigation menu or side drawer. And you have your, just like we talked about, agents, adversaries, and operations. Our plugins are described. And then our advanced concepts are described here. So our fact sources, objectives, planners, contacts, obfuscators, configuration, if we wanted to dive into that. I mentioned earlier the training. So in here, you can select your certificate that you want to pursue, in this case with the user certificate. It'll tell you what to do, a very nice, clean interface. It's not going to give you the step-by-step. Think of this as, I'm describing the concept and you have to go figure it out. And it may take diving into the repo, looking at, at the actual code in here to figure out what it's trying to get you to do. I'd say that's a very valuable aspect of it. It's not going to break it down for you step by step. You have to understand the tool. You have to understand what it's trying to do to get through that. Going through that exercise is valuable. There is documentation. As you can see, I've been in here quite a bit. You can see where some of the different links have already been clicked. But at the end of the day, this will get you started. It will point you in the right direction. So when we look at the agents, you'll see I have that agent is already running. we can see the host that it's running on, the unique POS, so I can run multiple agents on a specific device. It's over the HTTP contact. We can also leverage a TCP contact, or you can build out your own remote access, your own C2 agent to connect. And then the privilege level. So in this case, I did not open that PowerShell window at the administrator level, so it's got user privileges. We can adjust our specific components here to improve our obfuscation, to make our connections more hidden. If you don't know Rita from Black Hills InfoSec, these are aspects that you can use to test how effective Rita is at picking up a beacon when you introduce a jitter, when you make it more difficult to pick that up, when you stretch your beacon timing. And really, at the end of the day, test how you can tune those detection capabilities in your own environment. Within the adversaries, there are several pre-built adversaries. And so you'll see in some cases, like with APT29, these are very specific steps. And each of these is a different ability. In this case, you'll notice they also define what types of systems they work on. These are designed for Windows systems. This ability has requirements, is listed there, and it can clean itself up. So these are different aspects. Each of these abilities are meant to mimic what an adversary has been observed doing in an actual attack. So here we have, starting SandCat. SandCat is one of the downloadable agents that you can run. We're going to leverage PowerShell to, again, living off the land, basically take advantage of built-in capabilities. We want to collect information. We're discovering information about the environment and leveraging that. We're going to escalate our privileges and then inject our malicious code or process into a separate process. So taking advantage of something that's already running under higher privileges, and limiting our footprint, making it more difficult to detect our activities. So this goes through some very detailed tie-ups. You can see the automated collection from the clipboard. The T values here, these are correlated to the attack matrix, those indexes for the different techniques that are described there. From here, each of these abilities would be run. So when you set up your operation, you can view what's going on. As you can see, there's none here. It's a fresh install. So you can set our operation name and set our basic options, which would include what groups we want to use. By default, the red group is what's created. You can create whatever groups you want, reassign an agent to a group. In this case, we want to specify an adversary. So APT29 can be added on there. We can keep it open forever and run immediately, or we can pause on starts. We can basically trigger this activity to run as soon as we see an agent connect, right? So the correlation, if you are familiar with PowerShell, is if I get Death Star up and running, as soon as somebody initiates that connection, I have a grunt running or an agent running, and then connects back to my Empire environment. Death Star will trigger a whole bunch of activities to run. So as soon as it beacons back, it gets those instructions. Same concept here. We can do that. The autonomous aspect, I can run automatically or require manual approval for each step. I can specify the different planners. And this is where we can get more granular, where our decision-making activities can be more specific, refined, automated. And then where we have these different facts. So where we have these adversary emulation plans already built out, this goes back to the combination of the attack evals and bringing those in with a plugin called Emu for emulation. This has been added for us. So we're able to gauge our environment's ability to resist some of these observed adversarial attacks. And specify what we're looking for here. Clean up timeout in case we're not getting completion. We want to move to the next step. Let's clean up at this pace, and if we don't, we're moving on after, in this case, 30 seconds. These aspects, we can schedule these activities. It's there. Once we click start, what I'm going to do is actually pause on start. you'll see it wants to start, and I have the ability to click play here. It's running this against that group. Well, if we look at our agents, it's in that red group. So it would run against this target machine, right? So we have some flexibility here to pick and choose which devices we run against. We can have an initial operation to gauge what the device type is, what privilege level we have, do some basic system discovery, and then pick what group it should be in. So we can move between groups automatically. This is where we get those advanced concepts. We're still designing that methodology, designing that decision tree ourselves, but we're creating that repeatable process here. And that's what's critical. And when we're done, when we wrap all of that up, we have this debrief capability. And within debrief, each of the operations that runs will see this graphical representation. Within our stats, it'll describe the activities, each of the agents, the steps, and all of this gets exported for us. And at the end of the day, what we end up with is a really strong and detailed approach that we can export to PDF and JSON to validate what happened, describe the activities, describe the facts that were observed. We have that reportable approach that we can then in turn perform further analysis on. So this is the interface. You'll notice it's got little tips and stuff that scroll on the bottom. This is pretty polished and refined. It's a good view. It's very helpful, and it can be used by multiple users. We can set groups. So our red blues are our red group, our blue group, different users. All of that is configurable. Within here, we have our game board plugin that can allow us to see the scores. If we're running an operation, what is the blue team stopping based on their activities? We can in turn deploy different agents on the same device. So if we're looking at, how can I improve how I'm detecting, I can deploy a blue agent to have the incident response activities flow or just collect information from that device. If we're running Sysmon with, for example, the Sysmon modular approach to configuring that to tie the activities that are detected, the logs, to specific attack IDs, those are all pieces that fit together to make it possible to automate more and more of these activities. So all of this is great. All of this is excellent. This is, strong stuff. If you've got even a moderately powered laptop, you run this yourself, team up with your friends, and set up target machines, set up victims, so that you can work together to play with it more and more. So what, right? At the end of the day, what does it matter? Okay, it's a cool capability. Not everybody's going to be in a situation to leverage this, and that's where we want to take the discussion a little bit further, right? So when we talk about collaboration, one of the key differentiators between the largest organizations and then mid-sized organizations is how they leverage resources and kind of where their line is for profitability, for realization, for those kind of more businessy aspects. And one of the things that struck me after some of the previous presentations and discussions is just how many people work for mid-sized organizations. We think of the Amazons, massive organizations, a lot of employees within that one organization, but compared to the mid-sized market, those bigger companies, they're not hiring people the same way. They're not approaching it the same way. They're bringing people in to do something very specific, usually a lot of repetition within that. In some cases, they're wearing multiple hats, but generally the scale is so huge. You're not going to find yourself doing a lot of different things. You're going to find yourself doing a lot of the same thing. And that means the mid-market is very, very attractive for especially a lot of well-educated, experienced technical professionals. But the middle market has its own challenges. And I'm a cybersecurity consultant for my day job. I dabble in stand-up comedy in the evenings terribly, as a joke, of course. But in terms of, what I do day to day, it's primarily working with middle market organizations, especially in highly regulated industries, financial institutions, healthcare, aerospace and defense. These are organizations that conventionally have not had mature security programs. They just haven't. It's not part of the industry culture, especially in the middle market. And so we look at those ideals and best practices for security. We want that constant interaction between the security team and all those other aspects. We want champions within each vertical space, within each group, within our different operational units. We want that continuous improvement model. These are great. We have well-documented policies and procedures. Awesome. Is that real? I think even in very large organizations, these ideals and best practices are not realistic. In mid-size organizations, they're even less realistic. I don't think that I've seen any mid-size organization that I would say hits all of the marks for the CIS top 20, hits all of the marks for NIST CSF, hits all the marks for the OWASP top 10 for the web apps that they themselves manage and deploy and develop. It's just not there. There's a lot of reasons for that. The focus on differentiation in the middle market is to emphasize that they're more niche, right? So where GE will produce a ton of electronics that meet a lot of different approaches, and they can absorb the engineering cost and impact of a product that doesn't do quite as well as hoped. A mid-sized organization has to be much more focused on their specific niche. They cannot be the generalist, right? And that's where that comes in, because they're not focused on creating value through risk advantage. They're focused on creating value through differentiation. To facilitate that, a lot of organizations, most mid-sized organizations, everybody wears many hats. So again, on the career panel you heard previously, you're not just IT, you're not just developer, you're not just security, you're also doing data analytics, you're also consulting and training, you're also doing presentations and reports. That's the reality of the modern workplace. And very often it's a very resource constrained environment. We all want to hear about the Google interview process, or what it's like to work at Amazon, or how Microsoft develops leadership within people across the board to create more space for decisions on their part. But it's very, very difficult to find and retain good resources. So very often mid-sized organizations are struggling in this space to find the right people to come in and do way more really than should be expected of them. But it's for the survival of the organization. It's because that's how they stay competitive. It's because they're able to find people that are willing to take that on, that want to take that on. And it may not be feasible to maintain a specific role full time. And that's one of the biggest challenges that a lot of mid-sized organizations face. At just enough to get a couple full-time people for IT, but the gap between an IT professional and an information security or cybersecurity professional is huge. And that distinction is very difficult to bridge a gap, or excuse me, to bridge the gap across. That's a tough space to fill when you're looking at having somebody that needs to know Active Directory, that needs to know Office 365, that needs to know Exchange, that needs to know networking, that needs to know workstation troubleshooting, service desk activities, change management processes, that's also willing to do that work hands-on, but also report on it, and also facilitate audit and assessment, so that your third parties that need to review the environment, they're getting the documentation they need, they can interview and ask questions. All of this has to be rolled into just a few people in a lot of cases. It's a very challenging position to be in for smaller and mid-sized organizations, which is why they find themselves in this situation where they're focused on differentiation over risk advantage, and why it becomes so difficult to find and retain good resources. So we end up in this situation where very often IT and information security have some very technically strong professionals to come in and do the job, and management can just focus on operations. We need to be competitive in our space. We need to be profitable. Maybe I have investors to answer to. Maybe I just have regulators or a board to answer to. But IT just needs to run. Very heavy focus on availability over total security, right? And they're separate in a lot of cases. We come into situations where IT cannot describe the assets that they have that they're responsible for, and management is unaware of that gap. That's just a basic concept, is basic hygiene, but we're not able to bridge that gap because we don't have the resources, we don't have the tools in place, we don't have the systems. It's too much manual overhead to do that. So this segmentation happens, right? And so what we want to do is acknowledge those realities, right? For most mid-sized organizations, availability is going to be the highest priority. It shouldn't be. When we think about organizations that take payment cards or handle PII or any type of EPHI, that electronic protected health information, availability is not the highest priority in those cases. For cardholder data, if you are storing, transmitting, or processing credit card numbers, the confidentiality and integrity of your records has to be the highest priority. Availability, if you're down, you may not function, but what undermines the trust of the entire payment card ecosystem is when that's compromised, when somebody's card is compromised. So it's better for you to be down and not be able to process in that moment than it is for a breach to disclose 1 million credit card numbers, right? That's that distinction. Within the HIPAA world, when you're looking at healthcare, availability is not the highest priority. It is one of the highest priorities. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability are all at the top of the list together, right? You cannot go down and have systems unavailable, but you also can't have criminals selling people's records for $1,000 a pop on the darknet, right? It goes both ways. Insurance companies can't deal with the fraud associated with that. Individuals are losing a ton of money and assets because their information has been put out there and they're victims of identity theft. It goes both ways, which is why there's so many fines and so much activity around this. For a lot of mid-sized organizations, if they're devoting the resources, they're devoting the assets to it, it's got to turn around some revenue. So when we think about that concept of risk management, I'm not making money off of lower risk. I'm just not potentially losing that money, right? So we have to understand that balance. This is where that business mindset comes in from a security side. We have to recognize that this is the reality before we can bridge the gap to prioritize security. We talk about products going into development. Zoom is a perfect example. That mass explosion of use of Zoom did a lot for the organization, but it highlighted a lot of the problems of moving to market before we're ready, of not building security in, of not moving security left in the process. As we talk about moving security left, generally we're left to right describing a process or a workflow. We want security integrated from the get-go. So we're moving that concept left. That speed of time to market becomes a critical aspect of competitiveness for a lot of organizations. But when security is viewed as a hindrance rather than a feature, when security is viewed as an obstacle or a hurdle rather than a strategic asset, and it's not built in from the get-go, we saw it with Zoom, we've seen it with plenty of other products. It's something that gets bolted on after the fact, which is much more costly, much more difficult, and impacts our competitiveness, our reputation heavily. Those security considerations often are based on regulatory or statutory requirements instead of actually protecting the people that are using it, the data that we're processing, the availability of our systems, the confidentiality and integrity of our data, of our transactions. Often our regulatory and statutory requirements, they're not enough, or there's just enough gray area between them to allow us to hit the check mark, be able to check the box without actually being secure or resilient. And that's one of the bigger challenges too, is prioritizing not just auditable controls, but strong auditable controls that can be validated, right? We talked about wearing multiple hats and how the IT team is expected to handle information security risk management as well, which is its own separate challenge. Risk management as a discipline has a ton of separate and competing considerations and skill sets that, from a technical side, the IT team is not best suited to handle. And if you look at how financial institutions are regulated, there's actually a direct conflict of interest if you are doing risk assessment over yourself, if you're validating what you're doing, right? And it's built into the approach. We talk about lines of control or lines of oversight for financial institutions, and how within healthcare institutions, your information security officer, your privacy security officer, they cannot be the same as your internal auditor. Right? They have to be separate roles, because if you're auditing yourself, you immediately have a conflict of interest and you can't maintain that independence that's required, right? Even if you approach it in good faith, you're expecting to have addressed the issue. You have to completely remove yourself from what you've done previously, from your own thought process. And when you're asking people to handle this, you're creating a conflict. And we touched on a little bit, risk management is about improving book value. It's about protecting investments. Cash flow is a separate item. So when we have situations where to protect the book value, to improve risk management, we have to devote cash to it. For mid-sized organizations, especially those that are smaller, that are riding the line, that are in very competitive industries, that investment has to lead to cash flow, which is where that conflict comes in. So the question comes in, how do we bridge that gap? How to create this matrix role where IT and information security are not siloed off and separate, where they are visible, They're there. We have to create that connection ourselves. We have to be leaders within there. So as an advisor, this is in the consulting role, I serve as an advisor. That is my primary duty, is to advise, give them insights, give them information, point them in the right direction, right size, tailor all of that to the organization, to their needs, to their skill sets, right? It's not a matter of, hey, you're doing the right thing or not. It's a matter of, here's what you're doing. This is how you can get better that makes sense for you, or you're over investing in this area at the cost or expense of another area. Let's adjust, right? And so that requires me to have relationships with each department, with all of the key players, the leaders, and not just the heads of departments, not just the business process owners, but the people that are doing the work as well. I have to understand it from their perspective as well. The logistics of a change are more impactful often than the change itself, and how it impacts those workflows is critical to actually get buy-in and support. You have to work with those teams. IT and information security roles have to facilitate that. That matrix role, that concept, is about bridging the gaps across organizational boundaries. Your operations team, your frontline management, they often communicate with each other because they have to, because that's their role. The soft skills are critical for IT and information security personnel, because we have to do it beyond our standard role, beyond just what the job description describes, beyond that conventional picture. And for organizations that are moving 1,000 miles an hour, like many small and medium-sized businesses are, it's tough for those people to set aside the time and communicate with you. You have to find a way to get to yes. And that matrix role becomes a critical aspect of it. So where does this all fit in? We talked about all of the different ways that CALDERA can be used as a centralized point, as a centralized view, connecting our team members outside of IT and information security with CALDERA, with the way that we use it, inviting them to the table to discuss this, helping them understand that role, building that into security awareness training. They don't have to be the full-on technical professional to see that. They don't have to do that deep dive the way that we do all the time. We just need to leverage that as a tool to bridge the gap, right? With development, we want to make sure that we are taking advantage of the human side, of the human plugin, to try to automate more of that and move security left. It becomes a key aspect of how we interact with them and move security left. With internal auditing compliance, we want to be able to validate that we're doing this stuff and let them trust that we're doing it, but have a way of validating that we're doing it, right? And report that up. We talk about detect and that effort from Rabobank and our enterprise risk management and how we report to board, how we report to senior management, being able to show that we're mapping that and have validation behind it, behind that risk management approach. That allows us to fill that matrix role. So just as the core job role, just as the core functionality of CALDERA focuses on documenting, developing, focuses on those surface level areas, we have these other aspects there. We really want to focus down here and build out these capabilities. So I know I'm right just about at time, maybe just a little bit over. I'll stop sharing my screen just as a quick note here. If you want other information, feel free to follow me on Twitter. Feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. More than happy to answer questions. I'll stop here and turn it over, Lee.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. So John, if somebody wanted to get started with this, they're pretty new to, all this stuff, they should probably start with the MITRE framework first, right? Rather than start off with CALDERA if they don't even know, what the MITRE framework is.
Sure, yeah. So I'd say start by visiting the matrix and browse through it, peruse through it, kind of see and get a feel for it. When you want to start understanding it, you have to understand how it's used, how it fits in. And really that's about using the language and understanding how to communicate that. So jumping in with CALDERA is a great way to actually get some experience in how you use that, how you map from one tactic to another, from one stage of an attack to another, and you're using the right terminology, understanding how those tactics and techniques would show up when you're, for example, evaluating whether or not your systems can actually detect that activity.
Yep. Got it. Really cool stuff, John. Thanks a lot.
Of course.